Now, growing up, a lot of us probably had a favorite teacher. Who has a favorite teacher that they can picture and remember right now? In elementary school or high school, maybe? When I was in elementary school, my favorite teacher was Mrs. Helm. Mrs. Helm was my 5th grade teacher. And the year that I was in her class, it was the first year that she was teaching at my school. But she wasn't new to teaching. In fact, she had traveled all around the world and taught in international schools in other countries. Her husband worked for a large oil company, and so his job would often take them to faraway places for some lengths of time. I remember that Mrs. Helm had the most interesting and exotic stories from her travels abroad and from the students she taught in other countries around the world. They had just most recently come back from spending a few years in Saudi Arabia. And I have this vivid memory of one time she walks into class, we're all sitting in our chairs, and she's dressed in a full hijab and burqa like the women in Saudi Arabia would wear. And we're all like, oh, Mrs. Helm, why are you dressed like that? And she used it as a lesson. She said that this is how most of the women in Saudi Arabia would dress. And as a foreigner, when I lived there, I would often dress this way too, out of respect for their culture and their customs. She would import dates and figs and other treats from the Middle East and share them with us. She just had the best stories about traveling abroad. She taught us to explore for ourselves other countries, to explore their history and customs and traditions. She encouraged us to do our own research, and she expanded my 5th grade mind beyond what it previously was. She taught me to open my perspectives. She instilled for me a desire to travel the world and see other places. She made me a better person. She was a great teacher. So today we're talking about Jesus as a teacher. So far we've talked about Jesus as someone who calls disciples, Jesus as a healer, and today we reflect on Jesus, our teacher. And in Mark, as you are reading through it, you'll see that Jesus often teaches. He'll go and teach in the local synagogues, or he'll go and teach to large crowds of people. He'll even pull his own disciples aside from time to time to teach them and explain different things to them. Jesus does a lot of teaching. As Andrew read just a few minutes ago, Mark 1:22 says that the people in the synagogue in Capernaum were amazed and astounded by his teachings. He taught with authority, not like their own scribes and legal experts. Later in Mark chapter 6, maybe you read this week, the people in his hometown synagogue of Nazareth declared, "Where did this man get all this? What is this wisdom that has been given to him? What deeds of power are being done by his hands? Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this the son of Mary?" Clearly, Jesus had some sort of quality, something that made him stand out as a great teacher. However, when I read through Mark, as I've been doing, I sometimes wonder about Jesus as a teacher. You see, Jesus frequently taught in riddles and parables. We just got through a series looking at some of Jesus's parables, but he rarely ever comes out and just says what he meant. He asked way too many questions. He rarely answered any questions. In fact, if someone came to him and asked him a question, "Teacher, what does this mean?" he would often turn the question around and pose it back to them. Maybe a lot of teachers do the same thing today. But his stories were open-ended. They were kind of left up to interpretations. The meanings of his teachings weren't always entirely clear to his original audience, and they're still not entirely clear to us often today. Jesus even told his disciples in our reading from Mark 4:11 through 12, "The secret of God's kingdom has been given to you, but to those who are outside, everything comes in parables. This is so they can look and see but have no insight, so they can hear but not understand." In other words, Jesus says to his disciples, "Well, I'm going to let you guys in on the secret, but everyone else, they're just going to have to figure it out on their own or just be left wondering." Why wouldn't Jesus want people to understand what he was talking about? I wonder, did you ever have a teacher like Jesus? Someone who asked a lot more questions than they answered? Someone who wouldn't just come out and give you the answer directly or clearly? Someone who perhaps hoarded information and knowledge and kind of just doled it out in small amounts? Maybe you had a teacher who told long, rambling stories and you couldn't really figure out the point to them. I had a few teachers like that. It's pretty frustrating when teachers do this, And sometimes I think that Jesus was also a frustrating teacher. Mark 6:3 tells us that his teachings even offended people. The CEB translation says that they were repulsed by him. Jesus brushes off their response and says, well, prophets are never honored in their hometown or among their relatives and family. No, Jesus, maybe they were just frustrated because you wouldn't just come out and tell it like it was. So I question some of Jesus's peculiar teaching methods. I come from a family of teachers. Both my parents are educators, and several of my aunts and other extended family members are teachers. Maybe you can understand where I'm coming from too. A lot of you are teachers or retired educators, and so you can understand what I'm saying when I think that Jesus was often a frustrating teacher. I sometimes consider myself to be something of a teacher. In my pastoral ministry, I've always said I am more of a teacher than a preacher. Before I came here to be your pastor, I didn't have a whole lot of opportunities to preach regularly. And when I did preach, it was usually to middle school students. But in the roles that I've had in ministry before, I did a lot of teaching. I would lead multiple small groups or Bible studies or Sunday schools each week. I would write and create original curriculum. I would train adult volunteers on how they could disciple our students. I love to teach. Teaching is a part of who I am. And I think that those of us who teach understand that there's often a little bit of a mysterious quality in teaching. Something happens in teaching that you can't really fully understand or explain. You never know what it is that you might say that might lead to a breakthrough in a student, or might lead to them having that aha moment where everything suddenly just clicks. It's hard to predict what's going to connect with students sometimes. We all can think of the student who sits in the back of the classroom all semester long, goofing off, not paying attention, and then just has this most profound insight. And you kind of pause and wonder, maybe they were paying attention all along. There's a bit of a mystery that comes into crafting a sermon, writing a lesson, teaching or preaching. There's a bit of a mystery involved there. We don't always know how it's going to play out. Methodist Bishop Will Willimon, he agrees with this. He talks about in one of his books that he had been a preacher for many years, for 3 decades, and he had written and crafted and preached a lot of sermons. But he writes that the longer I preach, there's a sense in which I know less about preaching. Sometimes my best sermons, the ones that I've spent time and effort and care into creating, they fall flat. They roll over and die. And even more mysterious is that sometimes those sermons that are slapped together on a Saturday night, held together with tape and a prayer, are the ones that succeed. I can relate to that as a preacher. Preaching or teaching is often a mystery. So I wonder, maybe that's what Jesus meant in Mark 4:11, when he says that there is a secret or a mystery to God's kingdom. There is something happening at work when we teach or preach or talk about God's kingdom that we can't always explain, that we don't fully understand or comprehend. In fact, that's exactly the point of one of his parables that he tells in Mark chapter 4. We didn't read it, but I'm going to read it here. It comes from Mark 4, verses 26 through 29. Then Jesus said, "This is what God's kingdom is like. It is though someone scatters seed on the ground, but then sleeps and wakes night and day. The seed sprouts and grows, but the farmer doesn't know how. The earth produces crops all by itself, first the stalk, then the head, then the full head of grain. And whenever the crop is ready, the farmer goes out to cut the grain because it's harvest time." That line stood out to me. Something is happening in the kingdom of God, but we don't always know how. The kingdom of God is often a mystery. But like faithful farmers, we do our best to preach and teach, to tell others about Jesus, but ultimately God is the one who causes God's kingdom to grow in powerful and mysterious ways that we don't always understand. In my experience, though, I think a lot of times mysteries have a way of being solved. Me and my husband, Randy, we love watching true crime shows. And we love it when, there's a mystery, there's a murder, and the detectives work through the case and they work through the clues and find evidence, and it's like a puzzle that they're putting together. And then at the end, the mystery is solved, the criminal is convicted. Riddles are usually only told so that they can be answered. That's kind of what Jesus says in verse 22. Everything hidden will be revealed, and everything secret will come out into the open. But for Jesus' original disciples and for those of us who follow today, we find that the truth of God's kingdom was ultimately revealed in Jesus' death and resurrection. The mystery of God's ways, this secret of God's kingdom, they're only fully explained by Jesus' life and death and rising again. To an outsider looking in, a lot of Jesus' teachings won't make sense. They don't seem to track with our common understandings. Jesus taught that those who try to hang on to their life will lose it, but those who lay down their life for the sake of God's kingdom will be saved. Jesus taught that the first will be last and the last shall be first. Jesus told us to pray for our enemies, to bless those who curse us. Jesus said that those who mourn will ultimately be comforted, and it's the meek and the humble who would inherit the kingdom of God. Jesus was saying that in weakness we find power, and in humility we are raised again. But to those on the outside of God's kingdom, this thing we call Christianity, this thing called the church, a lot of that doesn't make sense. It doesn't track with the way our society thinks and understands how life ought to be lived. Jesus is this God who allowed himself to be killed by humans so that he could save those same humans who crucified him. That's a mystery. It's a sacred and profound and holy mystery. A few weeks ago, I had a friend ask me, Shannon, why are you a pastor? Why do you devote your whole life to this church and Christianity thing? She wasn't asking it to be mean or malicious. She just kind of wondered why I was a pastor and not just a really nice person. Sometimes it's easier just to be a really nice person. So I said to her, I'm a pastor, and I'm a follower of Jesus because at the end of the day, I really do believe in his teachings. I really do believe in the power and the beautiful mystery of Jesus' words and life. I believe in the vision of this thing we call the kingdom of God, even when it doesn't make sense. But I believe that it's a way of life that Jesus calls us to, a way that Jesus offers us to live that is better, a deeper way of being human. And just like my 5th grade teacher, Mrs. Helm, Jesus often opens our minds and our hearts and offers us a new way of thinking, a new way of looking at the world. Jesus broadens my understanding of what it means to love one another. And even when it's frustrating and even when it's hard to follow after these difficult teachings of Jesus, I wouldn't have it any other way. I'm a pastor because Jesus' teachings still compel me after all these years. And I want to spend my life sharing those same teachings with others. So Jesus said that his teachings were a secret, a mystery. But if we pay close attention, if we read the Gospels, if we look at his life and his words and his actions, that mystery will be revealed to us. And I think in no way is that mystery made more clear than in the celebration of communion, the Last Supper that Jesus shared with his disciples. The Greek word that Jesus uses in Mark 4:11 is mysterion, mystery. It's the only time in Mark that word is used. But he says, the mystery of God's kingdom has been given to you. And I don't think it's an accident that one of the words that the early church used to describe the sacraments of baptism and communion was that same word, mysterion, mystery. These acts are a sacred and beautiful mystery that draws closer to the heart of God. So as we come together to celebrate communion in just a few moments, we remember this sacred mystery, and we remember that Jesus, the teacher, invites all to come and listen to his words. Jesus, the teacher, invites everyone to come and partake of this table. It may be a secret, but he doesn't keep this secret or this mystery to himself any longer. He wants us all to join in.